All right, so welcome folks to our Pre-Law 101 webinar. This marks the start of this year's pre-law program. We always start with the webinar. We always kickstart our pre-law program with this amazing webinar. And today we're going to be having it hosted by Adavi Hassan. You'll hear a little bit later about her throughout the webinar. But yes, we start our Pre-Law 101 webinar. And then we transition over to our pre-law bootcamp. And then eventually we open up applications for the pre-law fund, which we offer $2,500 for people's, to support people's law school application fees, since it could get a little pricey. So we always start with the Pre-Law 101 webinar, where we do like a general overview of the law school application process through the lens of an undocumented applicant. And a lot of this came through fruition through a lot of the experiences of undocumented folks that have undergone like a lot of different spaces, even pre-law spaces, where their questions weren't really being answered by like pre-law advisors or even some law school students that didn't necessarily identify with the undocumented experience. So a lot of this comes from that, where we were just like, we need to have a space where folks can really get their questions answered, especially as they relate to the immigration experience of like being undocumented, and how to go ahead and like answer the personal statement questions, if you do wish to share about like your immigration experience, or how to answer like questions in your application, or are there waivers for folks with DACA or non-DACA, right? So I think there's just like a lot of questions that folks may have. And then also like how to like go about selecting law school applications. So hopefully some of those questions will be answered through this very general like overview that we're going to be talking about in the webinar. But later we're going to be transitioning into the pre-law bootcamp, where we're going to be hitting some of those technical pieces to the application process. So again, this is a very general overview of the law school application process through the lens of an undocumented applicant. Next slide, please. So you might be wondering, like, who is talking in this webinar? So hi, everyone. My name is Jesus, and I'm the Legal Services Programming Lead for Immigrants Rising, and we're an organization that's based in San Francisco Bay Area. And we do a lot of the work around supporting undocumented students and professionals in really achieving their goals, regardless of like their immigration status. We acknowledge that like folks, they're like one is not undocumented forever. Sometimes they transition into being documented, right? But our role in this whole thing is like, we really want to support individuals along the journey so that they feel supported in achieving any goal that they may have, regardless of that immigration status. So my role in this whole thing is I support undocumented individuals in achieving their law school application process, and like making sure that they are able to submit their law school applications, they're able to get their questions answered, and they also feel in community and supported along the way. So I've been part of Immigrants Rising since 2017, June of 2017. So it's been a while now. And my role has slowly transitioned into this pre-law manager, pre-law advisor. So now I will go ahead and transition to the next slide. So again, we talked a little bit about what the purpose of this webinar is. Again, it's like an overview of the law school admissions process through the lens of an undocumented candidate. We also will hear a panel of students and legal professionals, just hear a little bit about their journey, how they went about going through law school, and even after law school. Some of them have already transitioned outside of law school and have taken the bar exam. And lastly, you'll learn about our pre-law bootcamp coming up. This year, we're going to be hosting it in December. So actually today marks the day when our applications are now open for folks, and we'll be sharing the link. so that you can apply, or you can refer it to people that might be interested in applying. Next slide, please. All right, so I will now transition it over to Arabi, who will be leading an amazing workshop around applying to law school. But before I do, I actually wanted to just do a little bit of like an introduction to Arabi. So Arabi is a Bangladeshi immigrant who moved to Los Angeles when she was 10 years old. She is the co-founder and executive director of First Gen Empower. She has supported Immigrants Rising's pre-law fund since 2020 and is an advisory board member of the President's Alliance for Higher Education and Immigration. In addition, Arabi has recently graduated from Harvard Law School and has also recently taken the California bar exam and is currently waiting for her results. Crossing my fingers for Arabi. I think in November is when you hear back from those results. But I will now transition it over to Arabi, and in case I missed anything, you can also include it.
Thank you, Jesus. Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here with you all today. My name is Arabi, and I, like Jesus mentioned, am an immigrant from Bangladesh. I have been undocumented for nearly my entire time. I have been in the US up until earlier this year, when after nearly 15 years of navigating the immigration system, my family and I were able to receive asylum. But it took a long time. It took a lot of, denials and appeals and really having to figure out how to process your case through a really complex and inaccessible and very, very expensive system. So that was my main reason for wanting to pursue a profession in the law and wanting to make the law more accessible for undocumented folks in our immigrant communities. Jesus mentioned, I'm the executive director of First Gen Empower. It's a nonprofit that works with first generation low income and undocumented students throughout the US. So in high schools and colleges, to help them get to and through college and also find career opportunities. So when we work with undocumented students, a large part of what we focus now is in ensuring that schools know how to support students with or without work authorization, right? So if you're in school and you can't work legally because you don't have a work permit, your school should be able to help you understand your options, right? Whether that be independent contracting, entrepreneurship, getting paid through fellowships, getting paid through stipends. There are a lot of schools out there who don't know how to navigate that system of making sure folks are getting paid. So we help provide trainings and workshops and resources, a lot of which is created by Immigrants Rising, and just we act as that connector to make sure these universities are aware of what's out there for our students. Yeah, so that's a little bit about the work that I do through FGE. I went to community college before anywhere else. From high school, I just didn't know what life after high school could look like for an undocumented person. I didn't have any guidance. My counselors weren't able to help me. And here in California, we do have resources. We have what's called the California Dream Act, which is a substitute for FAFSA. So if you're undocumented, you get financial aid that way. I had no idea about this. I didn't know you could get in-state tuition even if you didn't have status. So community college was my only way to feel like I could go get my higher education and be able to afford it. And through that, I was able to transfer to UC Berkeley to get my bachelor's in sociology and ultimately make my way to law school, where I graduated from earlier this year. So I am very grateful for all the folks I met throughout these years who made my journey possible, and Immigrants Rising is one of those organizations and support system that I found. So yeah, I'm happy to be a part of yours and talk more about that journey and what the application process can look like just generally. So the first half, most of what I'll talk about in the beginning of this presentation really applies to everybody, right? Like, doesn't matter if you're undocumented or an immigrant, it's just a general application process. And then we'll go into specific considerations you should keep in mind as an undocumented person, especially if you don't have work authorization. What are some of the things you should be thinking about? And then we'll have time at the end for any questions that you might have. So our agenda for today, the things I'll be covering, just a general overview of the application process, things that admissions officers generally look at when they look at your application. We talk about admissions tests like the LSAT, the GRE, the GMAT. We talk about some of the essays you might need to write, how to finance law school, because as you all know, it is expensive, but there is money out there. So we'll talk about scholarships and loans. We'll talk about how you can go about figuring out what schools to apply for and ultimately attend. considerations for undocumented applicants, some next steps that you should keep in mind if you're planning to apply, if not this cycle, the next cycle, like things you should start to get ready. And then we'll end with a Q&A. We left a note there. This is a very broad overview of the application process. I will definitely miss stuff that are more detailed, and that will be covered in the boot camp. This is meant to provide you like a 30,000 feet overview of the whole process, and not necessarily be the nitty-gritty stuff that you need to know. That's more for the next phase of this programming. This is a general overview for folks who are not too familiar with what this process looks like. Yeah, so that's what we're doing today. All right, so general overview of the application process. So as even like in undergrad, like college applications typically, open in the fall, and same thing with law schools. A lot of schools have already opened their applications in September 1st. So most law schools applications are likely open at this point. And it typically closes in the spring or in the summertime, and deadlines vary by school. So you definitely want to make sure you know what the deadlines are for each of the schools. And that's something you'll hear me iterate over and over again. Not every school will have the same requirements, and you have to stay on top of that, whether that be a spreadsheet, a tracker, however you organize yourself. This is your best practice of getting organized, because the more schools you apply to, the more deadlines, prompts, and other requirements you'll need to keep on top of and keep track of. Early decisions will typically have earlier deadlines. Early decision can mean binding, which means if you get accepted, you have to go. That's not always the case. It depends on the school's early decision program and what criteria they have, but they do have typically fall deadlines, so like November or December. So that's something to keep in mind if you're trying to do early decision. Something that caught me by surprise when I applied to law school back in 2019, applications are reviewed on a rolling basis. What that means is, as they're coming in, admissions officers will review them in batches. So there might be a September batch, there might be an October batch, right? A lot of folks apply over Thanksgiving break, and then a lot of people apply during winter break. So those are the two big pools of applications that schools typically receive, because those are people's breaks. That makes a lot of sense. So the earlier you can apply, the more it will help you just get your application in and on the pile early on. I applied during Thanksgiving break. I was doing a pre-law program at the time through a firm, and they were on my case. They were like, it's November, you still haven't applied, you need to get your applications in. So even November for them was too late, but I mean, I was busy, I was working, so I tried my best. So do your best to get it in early, but if you're between like turning in an application you're not super happy about, or waiting like a few weeks longer to get it like, at a better quality, and making sure you've really looked over everything, I think it makes sense to wait a few weeks, because you want to submit something that you're proud of rather than something that's really rushed. So it's about that, striking that balance. Decisions are released throughout the cycle. Just because your friend heard back from a law school and you haven't does not mean you were denied. I promise you that. Sometimes law schools will just sit on your application for a number of reasons. You will never know. It might be because they liked you, but they're still figuring out what the rest of the application pool could look like. It could be so many factors that you have no idea and that are completely beyond your control. So just because you haven't heard back does not mean it's a denial. It could just mean they're waiting to see who else is applying and like filling out their cohort of applicants for that year. And if you're waitlisted, something you can do is you can wait out a wait list, right, while reserving your spot at another school. And usually a deposit is typically required. So if you get into one school, you can say yes, put down a deposit, and still wait out the wait list for another school. This is possible, and people do this, it's not an uncommon thing to do. So just so you know, if you're not like automatically saying no to everybody just because you have reserved a spot at one school. So that's something you can navigate as well. These are some of the general requirements when you're applying to law school. The first one that you might have heard of, the LSAT, the Law School Admissions Test with Writing. In the past few years, some law schools have started accepting other forms of exams like the GRE or the GMAT. So GRE is for grad school, GMAT is for business school. So they are also accepting those, and that's becoming more common. You will need a reportable GPA. And that's processed through LSAC, which is like the portal that you will be using to submit everything to law schools. You will need transcripts from all institutions attended. So for folks who went to community college first, or you transferred from anywhere, you will need your transcripts from them. If you did dual enrollment while you were in high school, so you did college classes while you were still in high school, and you received a GPA, you will need your transcripts from when you did dual enrollment in high school. So your high school GPA doesn't matter, but your transcripts from those community college classes you did, they do count, and you need to submit those. There will be essays you'll need to write, plus any additional optional essays that they might give you the chance to write. There will be a resume component. A professional resume could be longer than a page just because they want to know everything you have done. Recommendation letters from supervisors, from professors in the past. We can talk more about that, but you want to make sure you're submitting rec letters that speak to who you are, your work ethic, your academic abilities. There might be some optional components like optional essays, an addendum if you want to explain if you have a low LSAT or a low GPA. That's something I did. My LSAT score was fairly low compared to the schools, compared to a lot of the schools I had applied to. So I submitted an addendum explaining why that was the case. If you have any violations or disciplinary actions in your record, whether that be criminal or just from your, like when you were in college, so there's like college specific, you might have to submit a character and fitness statement explaining what happened. Yeah, that's something that you might have to do. If you're not sure if you need to submit a character and fitness statement, it's always good to reach out to the school and ask, because you don't want to later on get in trouble for not submitting something and they find out. So you want to be just transparent from the get-go. You do have to pay to apply to law schools, but fee waivers are available. I want you to remember that you should not be paying out of pocket unless like that is your last resort. There are schools themselves provide fee waivers sometimes. There are fee waivers you can receive from LSAC, again, the institution that processes your applications. There are pre-law programs you can apply to that cover your fees. Like lots of different pools of money out there that cover applications. So just keep that in mind. And the Immigrants Rising Pre-Law Fund is also money you can use to pay for your applications. So try not to pay unless you absolutely have to, because there is money out there. Decision factors. Before I continue here, Jesus, do we have any comments or questions in the chat box?
We did have a comment where someone mentioned that the Zoom that the presentation was like zoomed in. However, it looks fine on my end, but for folks that are joining in the webinar, if you're also having issues with the presentation and how it looks, let us know. But yeah, so far we just had one comment around that, and it could also sometimes be like our own server sometimes like play technical tricks on us. So just make sure that like your computer's up to date, or your phone, or anything around that, but please let us know. Oh,
Yeah,
we did have another question. Oh, sorry, Adavi, to cut you off.
no worries.
We did have one question from someone that they said, how can we know what are good reasons for low LSAT scores?
Ooh, that's a good question. I will cover that in our LSAT slide, so give it a few more minutes. But thank you for that. Yeah, that's a great question. Let me go through some of the decision factors first, because this slide has changed since we did this earlier this year, this presentation. As you all might know, the Supreme Court earlier this year overturned affirmative action, which means race data. So an applicant's race can no longer be looked at by the admissions office on its own. So race on its own can't be something that they look at, which is why we put in the bottom there, schools can no longer collect uncontextualized race data. So there's no checkbox you can check anymore to say you are of whatever race or ethnicity. They can, however, still consider your race or ethnicity as part of your individual application. We'll talk about what that means, but just so you know, race can no longer be looked at on its own as one of the decision factors that you of your application. Other than that, let's start with hard factors, numerical factors. So LSAT score, or the GRE, the GMAT, right? Whatever exam you decide to take, that's one of the main things that gets looked at. The GPA, is your next factor. The GPA is typically a combination of all institutions attended. So for me, it was both community college and my four-year Berkeley GPA combined together. And generally, and I really want to emphasize generally here, LSAT weighs heavier than the GPA. That's not always the case, and that was definitely not the case for me. My LSAT, I would say, was lower than a lot of schools like averages, but my GPA was higher, if not at the average, and I felt like, you know, that worked out for me. So don't let that discourage you, but just so you know, LSAT typically weighs heavier, especially when it comes to things even like scholarships. So once you do get admitted, how much money you're provided, the LSAT can determine that quite significantly. So the LSAT does hold a lot of power. Other soft factors that get looked at that are not, there's a numerical, you know, way to measure it, whether you're first gen. There are some schools that they actually ask that now, so you can like check that if you're the first person in your family to go to college. Socioeconomic factors, if you grew up in a low income background, if you grew up in, you know, a single income or single family household, if you grew up in poverty, like those are things that you can discuss in your application. Race and ethnicity, I put an asterisk because again, that can no longer be collected just on its own, but it can be discussed in your essays that you write. And if that's something that's important to you, you should absolutely mention it, because at this point, that's the only way the schools will know if you're a person of color, right? Like there's no other way for them to know if they're not collecting that data anymore. They also look at your resume, right? So your work experience, leadership, community service, anything you have done outside of the classroom setting all gets considered. Your personal and diversity statements. We'll talk more about the essays and how they're no longer called diversity statements, but they used to be in the past. They're kind of called optional statements now, like they don't really have a name anymore. But historically, for a long time, they were called diversity statements. And finally, recommendation letters. So I want you all to think about everything I just mentioned in this slide as puzzle pieces, right? They're not looking at just one puzzle piece. They're looking at all of these puzzle pieces and how they all come together to form who you are as a person. So there's no one puzzle piece that will definitely get you into one school or get you rejected, right? Like they're looking at everything to get a holistic sense of who you are as a person. And that's how you're getting admitted. So I want you to keep that in mind. Put equal effort in all parts of your application. Your essay should not be ignored. Your resume shouldn't be ignored. Like these are all really important pieces of the bigger puzzle that makes you who you are on paper that they're looking at, because they don't know who you are. And most law schools don't interview you. They will never get to meet you before they admit you. So that's your only chance to tell them who you are. And I want you to make the most of it and really put in your best effort into the soft factors, things like your, you know, resume, your essays, your rec letters. Any questions that are relevant to factors?
Yes, so we did have a couple questions around GPA. One of the questions, which I think you personally can talk a little bit about, Arabi, since you also went to community college, but we had a question around like, what if, how would you advise like writing an addendum if your community college GPA is slightly lower than your four-year institution GPA?
Yeah, I'm actually looking at that right now. That's a great question. I think, Oscar, you gave the answer to your question in your question, which is that you were working two jobs while you were in school. And, you know, like you had a lot going on, basically. So and this goes back to the question about like what explains a low LSAT. In my addendum explaining my low LSAT, which I only submitted to schools where my LSAT was lower than the average, because I didn't, like, not everyone needs that addendum except for those schools. My reason was, look, like while studying for the LSAT, I was working, I was taking care of my family who had health issues. I just had so many other things going on in my life. And the LSAT was just not, I was not able to prioritize it the same way. I also put in my addendum that I respectfully request that the admissions committee consider my GPA as a better metric for my academic performance. And I say that because my GPA was much stronger. So I like leveraged that to say like, don't look at my LSAT, look at my GPA. Like I did that. I consistently kept up a GPA while also doing a bunch of other things. And that speaks more to my ability to succeed in law school. So my advice to anyone who's in a similar boat is, so for someone who has a higher four-year GPA, explain like how that's more indicative of your ability to succeed in law school, right? Like you got it up, like it was an upward trend, which shows that you are able to perform at a higher level and that your higher GPA speaks to that. So you want to make the argument of, I was in community college, I was just getting started, I was working, like I was just overwhelmed, and I eventually got a hold, like I was able to, like perform better, become a better student, really seek the help that I needed, seek resources, and eventually get a higher GPA once I transferred to a 4-year institution.
And then in the topic of higher GPA, we did have someone ask, what is considered a good GPA?
It depends on the school. So a good GPA will be whatever the average, like the 50th percentile of that school is. So there's no like objective good GPA, right? Like a school might have a 3.0 as their average, but another might have 3.9. And like that's two completely different metrics for what a good GPA is. So it depends on what schools you're applying to, and like what their averages are.
Awesome. And then another, just in the topic of GPA, someone did ask, do pluses and minuses matter in GPA?
They do. And I really hated that because Berkeley had pluses and minuses, but then some other schools didn't. So it's like, it does kind of disadvantage you if you go to a school that happens to have pluses and minuses. I think it depends on the school itself, but those like whatever your school is doing, like in terms of the way you're graded, that does get calculated into how the law schools are looking at your GPA. That being said, I have heard from admissions folks that they look at how rigorous your classes are. So like they will look to see what classes you were taking. If you were taking mostly like STEM classes, for example, they know that those classes are really tough. If you come from a school that has historically like grade deflation, so Berkeley's actually one of them, where like everyone's GPA is just like really low no matter what like major you're in, that's something that the admissions schools, like they know, the admissions officers, and they will keep that in mind. So like your GPA, there's some context to how they're considering your grades.
Awesome. And then just maybe answering 3 more questions. So we did have a really good question around work experience. So someone mentioned, how do we talk about work experience if you worked when you did not have a work permit?
Ooh,
Yeah, it's
so
tricky.
that's a really good question. Jesus, feel free to jump in as well here, because I can only give my like how I would navigate that. I have folks, like I have friends who did not report stuff that they did under the table because they were like, I just don't want that on paper. And I totally get it. I really do. So like if that's where you're at and you just don't want to draw attention to that, I get it. I also have folks who like, I think for them it was like I'd rather, they essentially changed the title of their position so it didn't look like it was employment, but it just like it could have been an internship, right? Like, so I think there's like they kept act like what they did, like the actual roles and responsibilities were kept the same. So you were still telling the school what you did in terms of work experience, but maybe not include that you were working there full time, something like that. I can't tell you how to navigate that. That is a very personal decision about what you're comfortable with. Um, but I would say be creative, like be truthful, first of all, like don't lie about what exactly you did, but think about like how you might frame the position or the title itself, if you want to protect your identity. Law schools are not out to get you. They don't like, they're not going to go tell somebody if you worked under the table. But if that's something you don't want to put on paper, I do get it. So like I respect that, and I want you to feel comfortable with the process and knowing that a lot of people will be looking at your application.
Yeah, exactly that. I don't think I have much to add. I think also just letting you all know that like the law school application also includes a section around, I think it's like character fitness. So they will ask questions around uh like your criminal history and stuff like that. So, and it's not to like scare anyone, but I think it's just definitely like be creative with your responses, and sometimes like you don't have to give as much information that you don't really need to give. Again, it's up to you in how you want to frame your experience. I have like folks that are undocumented and now are lawyers, and they did share in their application that, like, for example, they did babysitting and they included that on their resume. And it's like it's not something that like I don't think they reported on their taxes. And yeah, again, it's like it's up to you and how you want to frame it. And all right, so we did have, okay, we are getting a lot of questions, so I'm just gonna go ahead and like do maybe like two more questions, and then we're gonna transition to the next part of the presentation. But we will keep your questions here, and if we have time, we're gonna answer them at the end of each section or at the end of the presentation. It's up to Abby and how she wants to do it. But the next question is around recommendation letters. And the question is, who can provide the recommendation letters?
Good question. And the answer is anyone who you have ever had a professional or academic relationship with. So don't get a friend, don't get a family member, right? Like those are obvious. So professor, and this includes community college. So anyone who you've taken a class where you felt like there was a good connection there, and the professor can really speak for you and your academic abilities. By the way, it doesn't have to just be a professor. It could also be if you had a TA, like a graduate student who co-taught the class. One of my rec letters was written by the graduate student in the class I took, and like co-signed by the professor, but I wasn't looking for the cosign. I was just looking for a rec letter from the TA herself. But it just so happened in the end, it was co-signed by the professor. Law schools they're not looking for like hotshot names in your rec letters necessarily. They're looking for people who can really speak to who you are and testify that you're a good student, you're a good worker, you have a good work ethic. So those are the things you want to get on your rec letter. So think about who can speak for you like that. Maybe it's your supervisor, maybe it's someone you volunteer for, a nonprofit you worked with. So be creative in who is included. But typically, law schools do like having at least one letter that's academic. And this could be someone you did research for, a lab that you worked in on campus, again, classes, TAs, but there should at least be one rec letter that's academic in nature. And for folks who've been out of school for a while, I know that can be tough. Try your best to get a hold of an instructor from your when you were in school, and see if you can get a rec letter. It helps to give them information to like jog their memory. So you can say, I took this class with you, that I received this grade. If you have any sample, like if you still have copies of like essays or exams that you wrote for that class, forward those to the professor so they remember who you are and then are able to write a rec letter for you. It's people are like say yes more often than you think that they would. So it's worth a try for sure.
Yes, yes. It's all about also like making it as easy as possible for your recommender to like remember you and write that letter of rec. And then we did get a lot of questions around just like general like GPA, LSAT. So we're gonna save those questions, more general questions towards the end. But one last question that we have from someone is, what if you don't have work experience because of your immigration status? How do you go about that in including that in your application or your resume?
You should mention that for sure. I think if one of your essays is about your immigration status, which or a lot of undocumented folks write about that because that makes sense, right? Like for a lot of us, our reason for coming to law school had something to do with us being undocumented. So if you're writing an essay about your immigration story, it doesn't have to be that you're undocumented. I mean, like it completely depends on what you're writing about. Your essay is one place where you can disclose, like, look, like, this the challenges of having to get through college and get through life and not be able to have formal work experience. So that's one thing you can do. And I think schools understand that, right? Like they have to understand that part of accepting folks who are undocumented is the barrier of they can't work legally. Another thing you can do is think really broadly about what else you have done that's not formal work experience. So like internships, even like supporting your family. Jesus mentioned babysitting, like that's a really common thing folks do. Mention those things on your resume. So even if that's not like working full-time at a company, that's still work that you did and labor that you put in, and it's worth mentioning on your resume to show like that's how you were able to get yourself through college or get yourself make money. So think broadly about what counts as experience. It could be work, it could be leadership, community service, volunteering, interning. If you helped out with your church, that's experience that counts. So think very broadly about what that looks like.
Thank you, Arabi. I think for now we're gonna transition to the next section, but I will keep your questions here with me. So, Arabi, whenever you're ready to continue as answering questions, they'll be sitting right here.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you all for your excellent and amazing and thoughtful questions. We'll continue responding to them. So timing. I mentioned rolling admissions, right? Which means law schools will look at your applications as they're coming in. So do try to apply early. Something that really caught me off guard that I should have looked into earlier, some scholarships will have early deadlines. So even if a law school's deadline is, let's say, February 2nd, the scholarships might be due on November 30th. So you have to apply to that law school by November 30th because you can't submit two separate applications. They typically ask for everything at the same time. So you really want to plan that out. Like, strategize around the earlier deadlines if you're planning to apply to the scholarships. And some schools like NYU have a ton of scholarships for first-gen folks, for students in public interest, for people of color. So like a whole host of different scholarships that all have pretty early deadlines. And it's earlier, like significantly earlier than NYU's application deadline. So plan that out, basically. Early decision, I talked about this briefly. Some schools like George Washington, so GW in Washington, D.C., has a binding early decision. So if you apply early decision for them and you get accepted, it is binding, but you get a full ride, basically. So you're guaranteed a full ride. So things like that, where you want to look at the conditions, like, are they giving you a full ride? Is it still conditional if you'll get aid or not? That for me is a little bit more, I'm hesitant because I don't want to be binded to a school where there is no guarantee they'll give me money. Like, that doesn't make any sense to me. So like, those are some of the things you want to consider. It generally helps more to apply early decision if your LSAT and GPA are closer to that school's medians. That's not always the case. That's a very like broad generalization, but that's something that I have heard from folks as well. But yes, my main advice with early decision is look at what counts as early decision for that school, because not every school will have the same early decision criteria, and not every school will be binding or give you scholarships. LSAT. I know we had a lot of questions about the LSAT. It can be like the most anxiety-inducing part of the application process for a lot of folks. So I'll give a quick overview and then we'll pause for questions. So LSAT has 4 sections, 3 are scored, and 1 is like a experimental section for the game or the exam organizers to test out new questions. They're logical reasoning, analytical reasoning, which is commonly known as logic games, and reading comprehension. For folks who are planning ahead, so you're taking the LSAT or applying like next year and after, starting from August 2024, so next fall, logic games will be replaced with an additional logical reasoning section. This is great news for people like me. I hated the logic games. I was so bad at them. They made no sense to me. My brain was like, what is going on? This doesn't make any sense. So this is great for those folks. I also know people who love the logic games. Like their best section is that. So depending on where you are in that spectrum of like how well you're doing with logic games, you're either very happy or very sad. But that is a significant change in the LSAT. And this was because they got sued because the logic games are technically a violation of the American Disabilities Act, because you have to hand draw the diagrams and there's like no way to replicate that. There is also an unscored writing section you take separately from the LSAT itself. So you can take it on your own time and another day. It's typically on a computer, so you just sit at home, it's timed, and it doesn't factor into your LSAT score, but schools will have access to that writing sample to determine like the quality of your writing, basically. Don't worry too much about it. Like, that's not the biggest part of the LSAT, like how it's looked at. It's more so to assess, to determine if you are a good writer. A low LSAT can be offset through a high GPA, through a strong resume, through strong essays. So basically having a strong application generally. So if your LSAT is low, I would still say get it up, because it determines scholarship amounts very significantly at most schools, but it's not the end of the road for you if it is lower. Especially for folks who come from disadvantaged backgrounds. You had a lot going on in your life, you had to work a lot. Those are things that I think schools consider. Retake the LSAT if it's needed. If you feel like you can get your score up, I highly encourage you to retake it again. The first time I took the LSAT, I got a 155 out of 180. And I was like, that's fine. It's an average score, but I felt that I could do better. So I took it again the next month. And this time I really just focused on studying the way my brain absorbs information and not trying to follow the test prep company's strategies. And my score went up 8 points and I got a 162. And so it is possible to get your score up significantly. So don't feel like this is it. Like I got the score I got, like I'm not going to improve. If you took it multiple times, you're only bumping your score up like 1 or 2 points, I think that's where it's likely that like you have kind of hit the end of the road. But I personally know people, even at Harvard, who took the LSAT like 4 times. It's the thing that happens, right? Like exams are hard. This is a really tough exam to crack. So if that's you, I think that's okay. But just so you know, like your school is looking at all of your like your scores, not just the highest one. So like if like that is something that will be considered. So if you take it 4 times, all 4 scores are getting reported. So just keep that in mind. I will talk about the JD Next program and then we'll pause for questions specifically LSAT related. So full disclaimer, I'm not too familiar with JD Next, largely because it's very new and hasn't started yet. So I only know what's on the internet, basically. It's a program that's 9 weeks long. It's virtual, it's part-time, so approximately 6 hours per week. It's a class that you take on law school skills with a test at the end. And it's supposed to substitute for the LSAT or GRE at 32 schools that are participating so far. I've dropped a link here that you can click later on that gives you the list of schools that are participating so far. So this is starting next year. I spoke about it with the admissions office at Harvard. They're not participating, but they are looking at it. They're interested, like just to see what happens with it. Their main advice for you all is to just check with each school that's participating in this program to determine how it's evaluated. The bigger issue is you'll probably still have to take the LSAT for every other school that's not in this program. And that score will still be reported to these schools that are participating in this program. So it's not like you're hiding your LSAT score, they can still see it. And so a question you need to be asking these schools is, are you still going to look at my LSAT score if I participate in JD Next? We don't know the answer to this question, and this hasn't launched yet. So I don't know if they know the answer to this question yet. So you want to like really do your research here before you participate in this to see if it's worth your time to do this for 9 weeks. Because if it seems like your LSAT is going to take precedence anyways, might as well take the LSAT. So my biggest advice for you would be check with the schools if you're planning to apply next year.
Also, I think something to consider too is a lot of scholarships, part of their eligibility criteria is still like an LSAT. So just also check into the scholarships that you will be applying to. Because I think that's one of the biggest factors too about like, especially being able to afford law school. So yeah, just check into the law schools you're applying to and like the scholarships as well. Super important.
Yep. So I'll pause here. Any LSAT questions specifically?
All right, I'm looking at some of the questions we have around the LSAT. Okay, so we did have a question around can exceptional extracurriculars and a good LSAT score override a low GPA?
I think so. I mean, this is like there's no guarantee, right? It completely depends on the school itself. But I think showing that you have a really impressive resume and you've done a bunch of different things, and like you can speak about it on your personal statements as well. Like it connects to your reason for going to law school, working on your LSAT. I think you are showing to the school that you have overcome one of the puzzle pieces that's like maybe not as high as like not as I think strong as the rest of your application. If you want to and you want to feel comfortable with going with applying to that school, you can always submit an addendum explaining your low GPA. Or like we talked about in the past, right? Like that could mean saying like I was taking care of family, I had health issues, I was commuting. Like there are people who have like crazy long commutes to go to school and that takes up a lot of your time, right? So if you have these extenuating reasons for why your academic performance was not as good as it could have been, then I think you should mention that in your addendum.
Yeah. Very good. And then we also have two questions that are somewhat related to each other, which is what change did you make, Arabi, with your LSAT that made it go up? I think you said 8 points or 6 points. And then also, do you have any tips on how to review, like how to go about like the logical reasoning? And the other question is kind of similar, which is around like what tips or programs or advice do you recommend to get a good LSAT score?
Alrighty. I'll go with I'll start with what changes I made. Um so before, when I was first preparing for the first exam in September, I think I was just like following, like kind of like without thinking too much about it. I was doing the timed practice tests, like I was doing the sections, I was looking at the videos that they provided, but I wasn't thinking too much about why I was getting stuff wrong. Like I just didn't think about it. I was like, oh, I got this wrong. I would skim the right answer and I would kind of move on. But I think my brain wasn't like completely understanding why I was getting stuff wrong. And I realized at some point the questions I was getting wrong, there was a pattern. They were the similar types of questions, basically. So there were certain types of questions where my brain just like could not comprehend this. So what I did the month leading up to the second exam, instead of just doing like mindlessly doing a bunch of practice exams and like not properly reviewing them, I really slowed down and I would like take my time with each question, look at the question, literally write out, like type out on a Word doc, like, here's why I think option A is the right answer. Like, here's like literally like the reason why I think this is the right answer. And then I would write like B, C, D. I think here's why they're wrong. And if I got it right, now I know like that my reasoning was correct. If I got it wrong, I would go back and I would just almost like rewire my brain to understand why. So I would kind of write out like, I thought A was right because of blah, blah, blah. But now I'm realizing I was wrong because of X, Y, and Z. So it was really painstaking, but it was a way of slowing down. So I wasn't doing like 500 questions every, like, going through them and like breezing through them. I was probably only doing like 10 questions in an hour. But my goal was to understand why I was getting stuff wrong. And that's exactly what happened. This isn't going to work for everybody. If what I just said made no sense to you, like that's you just don't study that way, and that's completely fine. But that's how I learn things. I really have to sit down with it, take a long time to crack one question before moving on. And it was enough for me to get my score up a few points. The other thing I did was I stopped trying to improve my score across all sections. I was like, I have like literally like less than 4 weeks left. I don't have time for this. I picked one of the sections that I was confident I could get it up. So I gave up on the logic games, basically like completely. I was like, I can't do this anymore. I was pretty good at reading comp. So what I did was I honed in on what are they called? Sorry, 1 second. Sorry. I honed in on the logical reasoning section. And so I knew like that's what I could confidently get my score up on. And that's what I did. So I focused on that for the next 4 weeks. I did a little bit of everything else, but that was like my main focus. So if you feel like there's one section you're pretty sure you can get your score up, maybe focus on that in the remaining weeks that you have left. And I know the other question really quickly I'll answer. Getting a good score on an LSAT. Again, trust your studying process. If you know there's a certain way you got through college, like you were successful in a certain way, don't discount that just because a test prep company is telling you to do something else. Trust that process. My other advice for folks who are working while studying would be you have to carve out time. You just have to. Like, it can't be an optional thing that you do. So what I would do is I got off work at 6 p.m. usually. I wouldn't even go home. I'm like, if I go home, it's over for me. I'm gonna go to bed. Like it really is over. I would immediately after work drive to Starbucks. I would put on like really loud, like noise canceling music. And I would just sit there until 8:30 p.m. And I dedicated myself to getting those 2 to 2.5 hours done. If that meant drinking coffee at 6 p.m., it is what it is. I ate while I was at Starbucks. Like Starbucks became basically my second home. Everyone there knew me because I was always studying. But I knew if I went home, it just wasn't getting done. It was a pretty big sacrifice, like I was getting home at like 9 p.m. I was tired. I wasn't hanging out with anybody. But I think for those few months leading up to the exam, that's exactly what I needed to do. And so I would say you have to carve out time. even if that means taking away from something else. So think about what that could look like for you. Yeah.
Awesome. All right, we can continue.
We'll
Thank
move
you
on.
everyone for those questions.
Thank you. And yeah, now we'll talk about essays and then we can stop again for questions. So since affirmative action got overturned earlier this year, the essays is the section that has seen the most significant changes. They no longer look how they used to. And unfortunately, they look a little bit more complicated now. Before, this bullet point at the top, it used to say essays are pretty general across the schools. We have to change that to they are now prompt specific, or excuse me, school specific. So schools have changed and they're no longer just asking for a general personal statement where you can write about anything you want. They have changed that now. They give you specific prompts and they vary significantly by school. So what you want to do is check the schools that you're applying to see what prompts they're giving you. You're still generally answering the question of why are you going to law school? Why law? What brought you here? Why are you going to law school? What do you hope to get out of being a lawyer? You're still answering those general questions, but the prompt itself for each school now looks pretty different from each other. So you want to make sure you're answering whatever specific thing that they're asking you. But like the overarching question here that they want to know is, why are you going to law school? This is a good place for you all to discuss your immigration narrative. That's what I did. For my main personal statement, I talked about how being undocumented, navigating the asylum system for 15 years, like really going through all of it. And that's what has shaped my passion for making the law more accessible for immigrant communities. So that was essentially my I just summarized my entire essay for you. That's what I wrote about. I wrote about my status there. For me, the decision I had to make was, do I want schools to know I'm undocumented? And I thought about this for a while. And my answer was, if they don't want to accept me because I am undocumented, I don't think I should be going to that school to begin with. It's a huge part of who I am. It's inevitably going to come up again. So like they need to know. And if they don't want to accept me because of this, then I'm not meant to be there and I don't want to go. So I ultimately make the decision of I'm going to be very open about my undocumented status. We talked about race and ethnicity. This is likely the only place, like in your essays, where you can now disclose your race or ethnicity. So like, don't force it, obviously, but if there's a natural way for you to bring up that you're a person of color or whatever race and ethnicity and culture that you belong to and identify with, this is probably it for you. And I think you should do that if that makes sense. If that makes sense in the story that you're telling. This was not the case. Like this was not a thing that applicants typically had to do, but now because of affirmative action, this is one of the only ways that you can. And my other big advice for you would be to start writing early. I started my essays in March and I ended up applying in November, and I was basically editing my essays from March to November. And that doesn't mean I was spending hours every single week. There were like weeks I didn't look at them. That's completely fine. But it was more so that every time I looked at it, there were bigger things I wanted to change. So you're giving yourself time to make those changes because you will think differently about what you've written so far. So that's something to keep in mind. Other essays that are additional, some law schools will ask you why you want to go to that law school. That you got to pull out your research hat, Google that school, find out what's going on, and you need to basically like be able to answer why you want to go there. This is a new thing now. A lot of law schools are doing like pick one prompt from a list of different prompts and answer that question. And it could be lots of things. It could be like, what does equal justice mean to you? How has your culture or heritage shaped your upbringing? So they're giving you lots of different options. Before, it used to be a general diversity statement. They're not really called diversity statements anymore, probably because of affirmative action getting overturned. So I think schools are trying to be more careful about how they frame this, but also give you more options to discuss different aspects of your identity and your upbringing and your life. For folks interested in public interest, so this means like going to the government, nonprofit work, immigration work, family housing, think very broadly about like community-oriented work. A lot of schools will offer programs or scholarships for you, and you will have to apply to that program using a public, and your way is to write a public interest essay. I had to do that for UCLA, where I talked about the immigrants' rights work that I do and how I want to continue doing that as a law student. And yeah, so that was one example of a school that offers that. Um, Scholarships. Unfortunately, you will probably have to write a different essay for each scholarship you apply to. This was a huge pain for me because I applied to like a bunch of scholarships. But think of this as again, puzzle pieces. We talked about that, right? Look at it as you are giving them different little bits of you that you didn't share anywhere else in your application. You're just providing them more puzzle pieces to evaluate you with. So think about other stories that matter to you and start brainstorming like the different topics that you want to share with the admissions committee. We talked about addendum. If necessary, disclose why you have a lower LSAT or a lower GPA. For folks who have things like you took a leave of absence for 1 semester or 1 year, explain what happened. If you have a bunch of W's in your transcripts, withdrawals because you had to drop out of classes, you should probably explain why that happened. So this is a catch-all section where briefly explain anything in your application that's not obvious, but you want them to know the whole story. If you're waitlisted, you can always follow up with an additional essay called the letter of continued interest, where you basically tell the school, hey, I'm really interested in coming to your school. Here is why I would love to be considered for for acceptance. Really short, but you can continue sending this over so they know you're interested. All right, I'll pause here. Any questions about essays, Jesus?
All right, just looking over. Also, Arabi, I think it's okay if we like at least your section goes over a little bit.
Okay.
Let's see. Nope. We can save the other questions towards the end.
All right, sounds good. So those were essays. Big picture, basically think about why law school, what brought you to where you are today, and figure out ways to convey that story. And have additional topics you want to write your extra or your additional essays about. And also make sure you're researching each school's prompts because they are now very different from each other. All right, scholarships. I know it can be really stressful to think about money and financing law school. And it is true, law school is very, very, very expensive. And that's something you want to think about going in, what makes sense for you financially, and how comfortable you are with taking out loans and if you're able to take out loans. So the good news is scholarships are generally available to all students, regardless of status. I went a little overboard and I applied to like 31 different law schools when I applied. And I have a very like wide sampling of like the different scholarship amounts that I got and like what people told me about scholarships. The one thing I'll say is thankfully my status was never an issue with getting a scholarship. Even if I didn't get any, the reason wasn't because I was undocumented, it was because they ran out of money. Or maybe they didn't like my LSAT score. I don't know. They didn't tell me, but I just didn't get any scholarships. But generally, not having status or being DACA recipient or not being DACA recipient, like none of that really matters for them in terms of receiving a scholarship. There are different types of scholarships. There are merit-based aid, which depends on your application. So your LSAT, your GPA, your work experience, leadership, etc. There's need-based scholarship that depends on your income or your family's income, depending on what they're looking at. There are schools that give conditional scholarships. Be very careful about those. That basically means they'll give you a scholarship as long as you maintain a certain GPA. And that could be like 3.2, 3.5, whatever it is. See if you can negotiate away that scholarship, that condition. And the reason is law school is tough. You never know what's going to happen with your life while you're there. If for any reason your GPA does go below that minimum, you don't want your money taken away, right? So you want to like it is possible. Some schools will allow you to take away that condition. So one of the things you'll have to do is negotiate. Be a good negotiator. Ask them if it's possible, if you can remove that restriction. There are external and private scholarships you can apply to. Immigrants Rising has a great database of scholarships that are open to undocumented students. So take a look at that. Your local bar association might have one too. So I'm from LA. I received a bunch of scholarships from the LA County Bar Association, from the Women's Lawyers Association, from the California Change Lawyers. It's a nonprofit. So lots of different pools of money for law school applicants and students. So definitely apply for them. The like $5,000, $6,000, they do add up and it can be quite a bit of money. And finally, like I said, negotiate your scholarships if you're getting them from schools. Don't take what they have. If you have multiple offers, like in terms of scholarship offers from different schools, put them against each other. If one school is giving you a higher amount, maybe take that to another school and tell them, hey, this school is giving me more. Would you be able to match this amount? Right. So like play the schools against each other to get higher scholarship amounts. So for folks who are good at negotiating, this is the time to really put that into practice because you will need to advocate for higher scholarship aid. Let's talk a little bit about loans. This can be kind of tricky depending on whether you're in state or out of state. And by in state, I mean in state in California. So first and foremost, as y'all likely know, federal loans are not an option for undocumented students. So anything through FAFSA, you're typically not eligible for, which means you have to look at everything else. So in the state of California, we have California state loans at the UC Law School, so California GMAT. They're pretty small and they won't cover even the majority of your expenses. It's typically a few $1,000s, but it can be enough to cover some expenses, things like textbooks, rent, groceries, stuff like that. So that is one option to look into. One other option could be private loans from banks. They do typically have higher interest rates, like significantly higher. So that's something you want to keep in mind. Another thing I noticed when I was looking at private loans is you need a US citizen cosigner. So think about if that's an option for you, who could be someone who could co-sign your loans. And the final like hidden gem of my application process was institutional loans. There are some schools that have enough money that they will just give you their own loans. Harvard was one of them for me and one of the like ultimate factors as to why I decided to go there over getting much more aid at other law schools. I didn't have to get a US citizen and kind of like, have them kind of like tied to me for the next 10 years of my life as I pay back loans. I didn't really feel comfortable with that. And so for me, having the opportunity to go to a school that gave me my own loans, regardless of status, was really big. Even if your law school isn't disclosing that, right? It's typically private law schools. Ask them if they have any institutional loans for you. I have asked a law school in the past, and their answer, the dean's answer was basically, I'm not really sure. We've never had to do it before, but I want to check for you. Like I want to make sure I actually am giving you the right answer. So that's something that was an option that she wanted to look into for me. So it is possible, and definitely reach out and ask the schools if that's something you're able to do or if they're able to do for you. Pause. Any questions on scholarships and loans?
All right, let's see. We do have a question that's not around scholarships and loans, but it's about GPA, which we passed a little while ago. And it's around for someone that went to grad school or is currently going to grad school to pursue a master's, and have now decided to go to law school. Will law school also ask for your grad school GPA?
No. Well, yes and no. You'll likely have to show you might have to show your transcripts as proof that you went to grad school. But your grades will not be calculated into the reportable GPA that they look at. It's only your undergrad GPA. So yes, because you'll have to show proof that you're in school right now, but no, in the like your grades don't count. It's a good question.
Awesome. Oh, and now we do have a question around scholarships. Is it realistic to work to fund your education while being in law school? So I guess it's like funding in general.
I'm very curious to hear later on from our panelists about this question. I will
Yeah.
briefly say yes, but I was working basically all of my second and third year of law school once I got my work permit renewed. But I think like you're working part-time. I was not able to work full-time because I did a full-time program, right? Like I wasn't going to law school part-time. So the money I was making part-time was not enough to cover anything but just like my weekly expenses, things like food and groceries and maybe a little bit of rent. So if you are doing a full-time program, I think that can be tough because you can't exactly work full-time as well. But for folks who are considering evening law school or like part-time law school programs, I mean, those exist so you can also work full time. So that's something you might want to consider if that makes more sense for you. But a lot of people I knew worked through law school, but my understanding of the way they use the money was generally to just kind of, it was a for their weekly or like their daily expenses rather than to pay tuition.
Yeah, yeah, it can be a little bit expensive. And then we did have a question around finding scholarships, and I can answer the question like separately around that. But in terms of loans for like attending the institution, are they open for folks that are undocumented? And yeah, I think that's just a question for loans.
Uh, Sorry, can you clarify institutional loans or private loans?
Well, it says, are loans for institution open to you even if you are, I'm guessing institutional loans.
Yeah. Okay, so this is very school specific. At Harvard, it was. So it was open to any like so they very publicly are like international students, anyone who needs loans, we'll give you loans. Because their whole policy is they will cover your cost of attendance no matter what, even if it includes loans. That's not every school. So my advice to you would have to be you have to ask the school itself and disclose that you're undocumented, right? So the first question is, do they offer loans? Because like that needs to they need to first offer money for you to even qualify for that. And then the next question is there any immigration restrictions there? But really advocate for yourself, like say you really want to go to that school, right? Like it's your top choice, but unfortunately you're not able to afford going there without money. If they're not providing scholarships, are they able to offer institutional loans? And maybe give examples of law schools that do this. As far as I know, Harvard, Yale, and Stanford have publicly said they offer loans to everyone. So, like leverage that as information that you can use to convince other schools that they should offer loans. I can't guarantee this will work. Again, this isn't something schools need to think about because most folks coming there can qualify for federal loans. So again, this is a matter of having to educate these schools about our circumstances and why we need their help and why we need institutional loans. Yeah.
Awesome.
Alrighty. So I'll wrap up with some considerations that you should be making about where you should apply. And I know I saw some questions about just like working, what can you do with a law degree if you're undocumented, things like that. So the first thing I'll say is rankings are not everything as you're thinking about where to apply and where to ultimately attend. You can receive a high quality education at many law schools, regardless of ranking. You should also know that if you haven't already looked into like US News ranking was a thing for a while where all these law schools are ranked, right? But now a lot of law schools are dropping out of the rankings, like they are opting out. So it doesn't really mean a whole lot anymore. Like rankings can still, if there are schools where going there can make a difference in terms of your access to jobs and opportunities, but don't discount schools just because you don't think they're highly ranked. It really depends on your career goals. Some schools are very regional. University of Wisconsin, for example, is a pretty good law school and they place very well in the Midwest. So that's, like a region where you're interested in practicing, UW could be a really good option for you. So think about where you want to end up ultimately. Some schools are public interest focused, so place really well in nonprofits and government sectors. Some schools are private sector focused. It places really well in tech companies, big law firms, corporate law firms, things like that. So think about where you see yourself ending up and how much flexibility or how open you are to pursuing different career paths. Attending top ranking law schools can help or help with certain careers. Excuse me, so big law firms, like really big corporate international law firms, it can help to go to a high ranking law school because their career fairs, when they hire and recruit students, they almost exclusively go to the higher ranking law schools, right? So like it's just set up to recruit from specific schools. That being said, you can always still apply. You can send in your resume, even if they don't come to your school. Some prestigious public interest jobs like the ACLU, for example, they are disproportionately folks from top ranking law schools. But I also, having interned there, know plenty of folks who went to schools that are more regional. So again, it's not a like for sure you're going to get those jobs and there's nothing that's preventing you from applying and getting your foot out there and putting your best shot in. So don't think just because you're not going to one of these top schools that you don't have a chance. You never know, right? So you should definitely put yourself out there. My one advice to you, though, is please apply to ABA accredited law schools. That's American Bar Association. There are scholarships, there are jobs, there are plenty of things I have seen that like where you have to apply for that says this is only open to students or graduates of ABA accredited law schools. So there are folks who end up going to, schools that are not ABA accredited, but I think that really disadvantages you. And tons of schools are ABA accredited. So that shouldn't be an issue of picking one. So just so you know, like there are restrictions on folks who don't go to ABA accredited law schools. Considerations for undocumented applicants, some factors that you should consider. Can you take the bar exam in the state where your school is located? California is one of the states where you can be licensed, you can sit for the bar exam, and you don't have to have work authorization, DACA, anything like that. If you don't have a social security number, you use your ITIN. But that's not the case in every state. So you want to do your state by state breakdown of where you can actually be licensed. The President's Alliance for Higher Ed and Immigration has excellent resources on this. So their tool called Higher Ed Immigration Portal is worth looking into as you think about licensing and where you can be licensed or practiced. Do you have to move to a state where you're allowed to take the bar? So let's say you go to a state to go to law school there, you find out, or you already knew that you can't practice there. Do you have to then move to another state where you can be practiced, right? So these are some of the considerations you want to make and you want to think about before you say yes to a law school. And finally, are there any financial aid restrictions? There are states that are considered prohibitive states where undocumented students are not allowed to receive financial aid. And if that's the case, then even if you could have gotten scholarships, maybe you personally will not be able to because you're undocumented. So you want to think about that and like think about if these are things that apply to you. And unfortunately, that is a reality of having to live without status is this is a profession that needs us, but necessarily isn't open and accessible for us. So we need to make sure we're doing our research in advance. I know I saw someone's hand raised. Jesus, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I noticed it too, but I think they put their hand down again. I think it was Carlos. You can raise your hand if you wanted to say something, but otherwise, we can continue.
Okay, I'll breeze through because I know we're running a little over time. Immigration status and admissions. Undocumented and documented applicants are often considered international students. Again, this is from my personal experience with applying to like the 31 law schools. I noticed that was kind of the box that they put me in. Even once I got admitted to Harvard, the international office reached out to me and it got really confusing because they were like, we want to see your visa. And I was like, I don't have a visa. And then they were very confused how I ended up there. So even after they admit you, they don't know how you ended up there. So unfortunately, the advocacy continues, having to educate folks continues, but you got to do the work to, because you deserve to be there. It doesn't typically affect the scholarship amount that you get, though. I know for undergrad, that sometimes matters whether or not you're international in terms of qualifying for scholarships. You can disclose your status in your personal or not diversity anymore, optional essays. But if you don't feel comfortable with that, you shouldn't, right? It's really up to you and your comfort level. And you don't have to write that in like an additional addendum to let people know you're undocumented. I thought for a while I should have done that, but I ultimately decided to just write it in my essay because that felt like the most natural place to share my story. Another advice I have is to talk to the admissions and financial aid office to see, to get an idea for how responsive they are to the needs of undocumented students. One of my stories that I had, this is from years ago, so this might have changed since. A law school in Texas, I think it was UT Austin. I tried to apply. They wouldn't let me get through the first page of the application because once I put that I wasn't a US citizen, I had to put my visa, but I didn't have one. But it would not let you continue to the next page without putting a visa, and putting that you're undocumented DACA was not an option. So I called them. No one knew how to help me in the office. And then ultimately it just got so complicated. I decided to just not apply. This was years ago. So I am hoping UT Austin has changed its application since then. But just so you know, like that does happen where there are schools that just are not, their application was not meant for folks without status. And you can ask them to help with their help with navigating the process. But also there are plenty of schools where you can absolutely apply and not have status. And I want you to know that. Don't feel like you are forced to go to a school where you can't even get through the first page. So that's something that I decided for myself. It wasn't worth it. Setting up yourself up for success. If you're currently in school, please focus on your GPA, explore new interests, you know, do extracurriculars, apply for opportunities just to see what you're interested in. Apply for things even if you think you'll be rejected because you don't know if you might be accepted. Build relationships with potential rec letter writers because you'll need them. Apply for pre-law programs and keep track of everything you have done, even the stuff that you think shouldn't be on a resume, because the law schools want to know what you've done, you know, and you should show them how much work you have done to support your community, your family. So just keep a list of all of the things that you have done, even if you don't think of it as formal work experience. Next steps, review our resources. Jesus will share more information on that. Plan ahead, so take or retake the LSAT, GRE, GMAT, make a database of all the schools you want to apply to, so deadlines, scholarships, the essay prompts, things like that. Ask for rec letters early if you're planning to apply this cycle, and if it's next year, ask earlier in next year, and please edit your essays because now more than ever, the essay is going to be a huge component of you sharing who you are as a person because race is no longer being formally considered. So like your essay is doing a lot of work and schools are relying on essays to continue the diversity of the applicant pool. So really do your best to get your essays in order. Some reflection questions for you all to think about. Is law school right for you? Is it worth your money, your time, your energy? Why do you want to go to law school? Think about future options. If you don't have employment authorization, do you want to start a law firm? Maybe do you want to do legal consulting? You know, you can't work legally, but there are other ways you can provide legal services. Are you okay with that, of going the route of entrepreneurship? Is that something that's interesting to you? Think about those things, but also know that you might not be undocumented forever, right? Like when I started law school, my asylum case had initially gotten denied, so I thought I was going to get deported. But I still started law school because I wanted to be a lawyer and I was like, I'm going to keep this going. So I didn't actually know if I could work legally after graduation. And thankfully it worked out for me down the line, but I didn't know that at the time. And so being undocumented is not an infinite, like forever eternal status, right? Things can change for you and you might be able to get work authorization down the line. And again, plugging the law school guide, which Jesus will talk about, that has more detailed information for you all. But yeah, that's it. Thank you so much for listening to me ramble on for over an hour. We have an amazing panelist of speakers who will share more of their experiences and answer all your questions. And I'll hand it over to Jesus now. Thank you.
Thank you, Aravi. It's always nice to get your presentation and collaborate with you. I think it's always like every year is just it continues to just show just like how resilient you are and also how passionate you are in like supporting the community. So definitely huge props to you, and you're welcome to stay throughout the panel if you want. But yeah, Gisela, Alexander, and Katiuska, we have this amazing panel of folks that have just various experiences in going through law school. But Arabi, if you can, do you mind stop sharing your screen so I can go ahead and so folks can see the panel's faces? So welcome, folks. It's so nice it's like a little reunion. But I'll go ahead and share my screen so that I can also give all of you like just a spotlight, and I can also just read some of your bios. So I'll go ahead and start with Gisela. So let me just go ahead and share my screen. All right, can everyone see Gisela's picture? All right, I see some nods. All right, so I'll go ahead and just introduce Gisela. So Gisela, pronouns she, her, ella, is a proud Hondureña from San Pedro Sula. Having lived throughout California, both Northern and Southern California, a true Californian, Gisela moved to the East Coast this past year to attend Boston University School of Law. She went to UC Berkeley for her undergraduate degree and is a former Greenlining Institute tech equity advocate who is passionate about working at the intersection of law and technology through a racial lens. Next summer, Gisela will be a technology and policy accountability legal intern at Just Futures Law. Gisela is also a former pre-law program participant. She also went through the pre-law fund. So if you have any questions around that as well, the chat is also open, the Q&A, so you can always ask questions around that. So I'll go ahead and transition over to our next speaker. Welcome, Gisela, and now welcome Alexander. Yay! So Alexander Lopez, pronouns he, him, él, is a second-year JD candidate at the University of Michigan Law School. After being involved in the immigrant and labor rights movements, he became deeply interested in how legal systems contributed to the systematic oppression of underserved communities. This drove his decision to pursue law school, where he worked in various settings to explore his interests. Alexander was a student attorney at Michigan's 1L Advocacy Clinic, where he represented survivors of domestic violence in immigration proceedings. And this past summer, Alexander was a law clerk with the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, also known as MALDEF, where he supported attorneys in impact litigation concerning voting rights, DACA, freedom of speech. And Freddie or Alexander, you can also go ahead and add your email at any point throughout the panel, but he also included, you can feel free to contact him with any questions about pursuing law school at falopez@umich.edu. But I think it's easier to just like paste it on the chat. But anyway, I'll go ahead and transition to our next speaker. Welcome, Kati. So Katiuska, pronouns she, her, ella, migrated to the US at the age of 15 without her parents from Lima, Peru. She grew up in Novato, California, and worked during high school as a babysitter, retail worker, and restaurant worker. Katiuska graduated with honors from UCSC or UC Santa Cruz and worked for 2 years as a community organizer and paralegal before applying to law school. In law school, Katiuska worked at the Intellectual Property and Technology Clinic, supporting small businesses with IP-related issues. Recently, Katiuska gained valuable experience as a legal intern at DoorDash Incorporated and collaborated with the in-house intellectual property, commercial, and privacy teams. She supported the development of a privacy center offering users, stashers, and merchants guidance on how to access their privacy rights. In May 2023, Katiuska graduated law school, magna cum laude, wow, with a certification in intellectual property and technology law. She is currently enjoying her time off, yes, from school while waiting for her California bar results. So very similar shoes as Arabi, who you all heard from recently. Welcome to the three of you. And I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing my screen so that you all can see the speakers. But my question to the panelists is, why law school? And anyone can start at any point, but yeah, why law school? Why did you decide to go through this experience?
I think
guess I can go first.
Okay, just start.
I know, Sosia. Thank you so much, Jesus. I'm always so happy to see you. Your energy is like amazing. But yeah, I think that for me, it was taking an internship at the public defender office. I feel like that's the first time that I got involved with the law. Because before that, I was doing policy work, and policy is like completely different than like legal work. And that's something that even after I attended law school, and even now as I graduated, I graduated of law school. Now I'm like, okay, I want to, the laws are like really rigid. Like in there the law, you know, the law is the law, and sometimes you just have to apply the law. So like, how can we do policy? So I'm actually meeting with people and trying to explore that. But for me, it was first starting with like the curiosity of like, through my organizing background, and then working at the public defender as an investigator. There's an internship and an externship that they do. A lot of courts have free internships that you learn so much from, but they're sadly they're unpaid, but they're a great opportunity to kind of get that first experience in the law. So I'll say that will be my.
Well,
Thank you,
first,
Kathy.
thank you. Thank you, everybody in the panelists. I feel like I'm such a fan of you, Katiuska. So excited to hear more of you. I'm like, because you're like ahead of me. So I'm like, whatever. Okay, if she does that, I know I could do it, you know? So I think where I was just scouting what are people doing to see what's available to us. But in terms for me, I think I was involved in the law because of my immigration status, and then being a legal advocate with Immigrants Rising, I knew that immigration law was a path. But I decided to go to law school, not trying to seek immigration, but actually to do work at the intersection of law and technology. And that came about the Tech Equity Policy Fellowship I did with the Green Lending Institute, because I worked under two attorneys doing like AI work or like digital divide issues. And I just felt like there wasn't many of us in that space, and that could give me, that could challenge me. And I just was just, I think, excited about the topic. It was just something that I feel like I would push me through law school, because law school is hard, and coming in with a purpose to do work at the intersection of both law and technology has been definitely like a North Star. But I think the reality of it as well, I felt like law would be an avenue for me to create some sort of business as a non-DACA individual. And I think that's one of the realest answers for me in my life. I think that's a real thing. You have to be very strategic about what you can and cannot do with your situation. And I felt like that would give me credibility and would give me like some hard skills that I could then, you know, provide as a legal consultant. I think that those are some of the reasons why I pursue law.
Hey everyone, can you hear me? Perfect. Okay. Hi, happy to be here again. Thank you for the invite, Jesus. And I echo the whole being a fan of Katiuska. Like, not that grades matter that much, but like graduating magna cum laude is so hard. Like, you don't understand how hard it is to do that at any law school. So kudos to you. In regards to why I went to law school, I have always kind of been like a nerd, and this has always just been very like intellectually curious to me. I attended a pre-law program in high school where we talked to attorneys and we did like a mock trial, and I just completely fell in love with it. I like knew since very little that I wanted to go to law school because it combined a lot of the things that I like to do, right? Like reading, writing, critical thinking, advocacy. And then I got super involved in like the immigrant rights movement and the labor rights movement. And I just constantly kept thinking law affects every aspect of people's lives, especially when like your identities are sometimes taken as political, right? So like being undocumented, being a person of color, being gay, like these are all identities that I had and that were affected by legal systems and structures. So I just wanted to go, and I thought it would be something fun to do, and it is very fun. I find it fun. So yeah.
I'm just loving how like everyone is just fangirling over Katiuska. Here I am fangirling over the three of you. I think it's such a pleasure and an honor to have been connected with the three of you over the course of all these years. Gisela actually used to be a fellow through Immigrants Rising, and just watching her progression into now law school and eventually into like a legal professional has just like, I think that's just one of the rewards of like doing this kind of work, and just seeing how even just your responses and how you navigate some of these questions is just like watching your growth. Being able to witness it is honestly like, I don't know, it's amazing. But anyway, we did have a lot of questions around financial aid, and a question that I have for the three of you is, how did you navigate financial aid, especially since some of the folks in this space don't have DACA? So that actually adds an additional layer of difficulty, specifically because some scholarships specifically say DACA recipients only, but not all of them. So I'm just curious, like, how did you navigate financial aid, since that could sometimes be a critical factor on whether or not some folks decide to go to law school or not?
I can start. So for me, it was a lot of like merit aid and just like scholarships in general. I did have to fight Michigan to like give me more money, pretty much. Like, and this is where applying early in the cycle really comes in the clutch, because the more time you have between acceptances and when you have to make a decision, the more time you can spend trying to figure out where am I going to get this money from. So having like an early acceptance from Michigan, and like as I was getting acceptance from other schools that I knew I wasn't super interested in going, but were actually giving me money, like I could come back to Michigan and say like, hey, like give me more money, and just having like a whole talk with them. So they kind of are covering half, and then I kind of covered the other half through like scholarships from this nonprofit organization that I had like previously worked for before. And they kind of were like, yeah, we have like some money left over, like we can like help you out. So it's kind of just, it was a lot of talking to people, right? And like talking to all my mentors and literally everyone that I knew that had money or power or some sort of influence, and just telling them, hey, like I got into this school that I really want to go to. I have this much amount of money left to cover. Can you help me out? And it was really just my mentors helping me figure things out.
For me, I think without financial aid, there's no way that I would attend law school. It's just super expensive. That's the reality of it. And then me not having DACA, I was just applying essentially to schools that had some sort of scholarships that could give me a shot to getting a full tuition scholarship. And that's one of the reasons why I ended up going to BU, because BU offered me a full tuition scholarship. And that wasn't merit-based. That came out of essentially me doing a lot of like social justice related work. And then I think especially like having like a technology component maybe made me like stand out, who knows. But I ended up joining a cohort of 8 of us who got full tuition scholarships. And it's for people essentially that promise to contribute in one way to building a more anti-racist society. And they don't, it's not contingent on your GPA, and you don't even have to go into like public interest work. You could go into big law, you can do whatever you want. But I think if I wouldn't have gotten that scholarship, there's absolutely no way. And my school also gives me institutional loans. So I didn't have to figure out that part. So that's kind of like how I've been navigating my situation. I think because I go to a private school, maybe makes it easier sometimes, or maybe there might be more funding. They don't advertise institutional loans to everybody. I think I was just very open about my situation, and they want to help me out. And a lot of times they don't know everything, as in like they haven't dealt with a lot of undocumented students, but I feel like they just have the willingness to help. And that has been the thing that has worked for me.
Yeah, I think that I agree with what everybody said. I feel like it's crazy because it's just a piece of paper that we pay so much money for. And then you take the bar and you're like, I don't know what I learned in law school. It's not what it's on the test all the time. And so it's like interesting how much money is in this, business of law school and stuff. But I feel like for me, one of the ways that you can pay for law school is getting really good grades. So that's why for me, I also don't have DACA. So I was like, I talked to my dean and I was like, hey, this is my situation. And I remember they said, well, if you make it to the top 15 of your first year class, as a 1L, then you get into this McLaughlin. I cannot pronounce how it's called, but it's like this fancy society. And then we give you another big scholarship. And I was like, oh, wow. Okay. So then I'm going to try my best. And I really became obsessed on like doing my best in law school. And I ended up getting to that 15%. And I got the scholarship. And that's why I was able to return to my second year of law school, because my second year didn't have any scholarship. So I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to come back. So that being said, I feel like if you're already in law school, or if you're thinking about applying to a law school, make sure you ask them about like academic merit-based scholarships that you can get if you have good ranking on your class. That's also increases your the money that they give you. Or even if you did, like you don't have to be in the top 15. I think even people were just top 25 or 30, they still got an increase on their scholarship. So I will say that's one way. And another thing is there's some law schools that have tutoring that you get paid for tutoring. So it's just a way to get extra money during law school. And then the third thing I'll say, it's like really fundraising for yourself. So reach out to all the mentors that you had in high school, in college, literally everybody, and say, hey, I'm thinking about going to law school. I made my budget and this is how much I need to pay for this year of school. If you just reach out to them and you're like, oh, I want money for law school, they're gonna be like, there's like they're probably gonna be like, oh, I don't know. But if you tell them, there's actually science on this, but if you tell them I need this specific number to cover for tuitions, and you're gonna see they're gonna try to get you to that number. For some reason, when you give humans like really clear goals, they tend to be more effective than when you give them like something really vague, right? Like, I just need money for law school. So that's my one thing. And then really just not being afraid to ask for money from anybody. I actually met people in law school who had mentors who pay for the whole like tuition. There's a lot of rich people out there, especially in Marin County, I'll say, that need to give more money to students. So I think that you just have to find the right people to invest on you. And I had a mentor who took me to her church and I got $7,000, and I only talked by like 15 minutes and I got $7,000 by this church. So like, don't be afraid to ask, and you never know, someone will have some money out there for you.
Absolutely. And I think you mentioned, the three of you mentioned two very important pieces. One is like reaching out to your law school. And I think it's also something that Arabi mentioned in her presentation, which is like, how does your law school respond to your questions? Are they receptive to your questions? Are they like, do they already have someone that's like a go-to and they're fully trained on how to support undocumented students, or how to answer questions around our needs? And if they don't know how to respond to those questions, perhaps that school is not right for you. Or if they just don't like do a good job about it. And then the second piece is around tapping into your networks and your community. As Katiuska said, like you'd be surprised how many people have money out there, and how many people are willing to give. So definitely those pieces. So my next question for the three of you is, I know LSAT is another hard factor that a lot of people tend to get stuck on. And sometimes that could be a factor that a lot of people feel like they feel motivated or unmotivated to continue with their law school application. So my question to the three of you is, how important was an LSAT score for you in getting to where you are or where you were?
I can go
I'll
ahead.
start.
Oh,
Or
go ahead. No, go ahead. Go
I was
ahead. Go
just
ahead. I
gonna
started.
say, I mean, there's no, I mean, I think it is important. In the first time I took the ELSA twice because I feel like my first ELSA would not give me a scholarship. You know, I think there's that reality of like, you know, if you're the admissions person, you want to like push them in a way like, you know what, she has a great story. Her else it's okay, but we can work with that, you know, versus like she has a great story, but like this is kind of like hard for them to like, you know, essentially recommend you, because a lot of times like they are having internal discussions about like about how you're gonna fit, you know, into the classroom, whether you're gonna get good grades, whether you're gonna you know, be okay with the stress. I think it matters, but it's not everything. I think your story as well, like the jobs you do, the way you present yourself is important. But for scholarship purpose, it is very important. I think I got super lucky, and I can disclose my LSAT score. I got a 160 my second time, and I feel like, yeah, I don't think it was necessarily the best, but I felt like just seeing that 6 mentally for myself, I knew that I'm like, I can bargain my way out of this or something. And to get a full tuition scholarship with the 160 is hard, you know. So it really depends what scholarship you're applying as well, what school and what they consider is important. Because yeah, some specific scholarships, like they don't necessarily care so much about the LSA. They just want to make sure that it's there to reinforce the rest of your application. At least that's my experience with them.
Yeah, I think what I will say, I definitely think it matters because it's a metric that is going to be used to decide whether or not you're admitted or not. So it's a part of the application that I think some law schools are more strict than others. Like if you're trying to go into a top tier school, there's certain LSAT scores that they will require, or like, you know, there might be one person that gets to Harvard Law that doesn't have, you know, like perfect score or something, you know. When you look at their stats, like there's always that one dot, one dot, like one person. So like just being realistic of, you know, where your strengths are. And if the LSAT it's not your strength, I will say try private tutoring if you have the money, and try definitely take a class and take time off work if you can to focus your full self on in the exam. And I couldn't do that. I actually had to work full time, and that's why my score wasn't that great. And you know, I was looking more to just like get to the like high biggest scholarship I could get, but I knew I couldn't get a full ride with my LSAT score. So if the LSAT it's not your strength, then try to get really good grades in undergrad. So like I'm saying, like a 3.0, 3.8 and above will be great, but a 3.7 good. Even if you get 3.5 or above, because at least your GPA shows that you're academically strong. So one of the things that, you know, I wrote an addendum for my LSAT score, because I got a 151, you know, and it wasn't great, but I was like, here in you know, I showed that in undergrad I had a 3.85, you know, and I showed that I had gotten A's and I was like good at other parts, and that kind of helped me. And I even got into Santa Clara Law, which is a great law school, but I ended up not going there. So like, because they didn't give me enough money, and I also don't have that guy, and I was like, I want to stay in California, and USF was the one that gave me the most tuition money for the first year. So I was like, I'm gonna take it. Actually, Golden Gate gave me a bigger scholarship, but I decided to go to USF because of their clinics. But yeah, I think just do your research and try your best at the LSAT. But if it's not your strength, then figure that out earlier than later, because you don't want to graduate college and not have a good GPA and also not have a good LSAT. You want to have one of the two, you know. And if you have a low LSAT, just highlight on an addendum the things that you did in undergrad that puts you in a good academic position, right? I said I got an A on this final in undergrad, which shows that I can perform in a classroom setting and I'm really good at, you know, like academic performance, not good at standardized testing. But they do look at that, but there's ways that you can go around it, like I said.
Yeah, I echo everything that Gisela and Katiuska have been saying. Just like two quick things. One on admissions practices, and two on like how ELSA relates to how you actually do in law school. So like first, admissions, if you have like, let's say you're under the median of their LSAT, but you're above the median in their GPA, apply. Like if you're like a splitter and you want to go to the school, just apply. Like that's kind of what I did. I knew like early on that the LSAT was not going to be my strength. So then I just make sure that like the rest of my application was literally perfect. And I highlighted like things that other people don't typically do. Like I was like published twice for research. I was the top graduating student in my program. Like there were so many other things to me and my academic career that I feel like highlighted more of my potential than my score. So I just highlighted those in my application, also wrote an addendum. Like the way that it's described here at Michigan, like I won't lie to you, like 80% of the people here have like a 170 or above, but then I had a 157. So like it's possible, it's doable. It's just like about being very strategic. And if you have like the GPA, but you don't have the LSAT, I still encourage you to apply if you can afford it. Like it just doesn't hurt to shoot your shot. Second, like as you probably already can tell, like your LSAT doesn't really have a lot of correlation to how you do in law school. Like some of my grades are better than some people that have gotten a 170 on their LSAT, right? Like Katuska is like top 50% and she got a 151. So like is don't be, even if you get a low LSAT score, don't let that get to you and think, oh my God, I'm gonna suck as a lawyer. Oh my God, I'm gonna suck as a law student, because that's not what the test really measures, even though it says that's what it's measured. What it's measuring is how many resources and time and how much time did you have for preparing for the exam. That's really what the LSAT measures.
Exactly. I think the three of you really hit the nail on the coffin. I think that's how the expression goes. And also just acknowledging that like even the LSAT, like I think historically a lot of folks that are multilingual, bilingual, don't perform well in like standardized exams. So also just like acknowledging that as well. And yeah, I think like a lot of us have that immigrant experience and we speak more than one language. I think that also plays a factor. I know when I was taking the LSAT, I was like, what is this? I don't understand this language. It felt like physics. But we do have a great question, which is around getting work or internship experience, especially as an undocumented applicant. So someone asked, what type of work or internship experience do you recommend folks doing that would help for like people's law school applications? And maybe if like you can share your personal experience, especially like having that challenge of like not being able to, for folks that are fully undocumented, like that are not able to accumulate like professional work experience or just any work experience. And where would you find those opportunities? I know it's kind of like a loaded question.
Yeah, I think that's hard. I feel like for independent contracting, like I always work ever since I was in high school, and I work without authorization. I work with a fake social. I already disclosed that, so no issues. But I think that, being really strategic with mentorship and with where you want to go. So after I graduated college, it took me 3 months to get my first consulting position with a nonprofit. And it's just the job market, it's really competitive. And I had to try, and I got rejected many times before I met the executive director of Siren. And I was really straightforward with her. I was so comfortable talking about my status during a job interview. It was kind of scary. Like I was literally walking in and being like, hey, I have a lot of community organizing experience. Like I'm the candidate you want, but I don't have a work authorization, and I'm gonna need you to do this other process with me. And then at the beginning, she said, like, let me think about it. But then she ended up giving me the position. And I was working about more than 40 hours a week. And then I was getting paid like $27 an hour, which was like really high. I mean, for me, right, as a college graduate, I was like, oh my God, that's amazing. And I was making really good money. And then I started, while I was networking with nonprofits, I started also getting more clients of other nonprofits, and I will do community outreach. So there's so many grants for community outreach where they want people to do presentations. So if you're good at like public speaking, you can reach out to nonprofits and be like, hey, do you need me? I'm a consulting agency that does community outreach. Would you want me to go? And then I started actually getting calls by other nonprofits. And then all of a sudden I had like different people I was working with, but it took a while. And right now that I graduated law school and I'm looking for consulting and I'm doing like legal drafting, it's still kind of like you have to have that entrepreneurship experience and like reach out to clients and like get, get that experience like that. But another way that you could do it is thinking about an unpaid position that could possibly lead to like a scholarship for law school. So one of my summers during law school, I worked at a firm and they couldn't pay me because I don't have a work authorization, but they ended up giving me $25,000 of a scholarship for a whole year of law school. So if maybe you can find a legal organization or a nonprofit or even like a law firm that will give a scholarship for you to go to law school, like that's a way that they could pay you. They're contributing to your education but not violating employment laws. Now I'm gonna be real, after this law, I think it's called SB5, it became a lot harder for people to be independent contractors in California, and there's certain regulations that people, like for example, you cannot hire independent contractors if it's the same type of work that your organization is doing. So because they want you to be on the payroll, so you get rights, and it's definitely better for workers, but for people doing independent contracting, it made it a lot trickier, because then now you have positions that used to be 1099 that now have to go through the payroll system. So just being aware of that law specifically and really reading what it means. And because I feel like if you're asking them to do something different for you, you have to be educated about it, right? Because if you go to any organization and you tell them I want to do independent contracting and you don't know what SB5 is and you don't know like how, all this legal background, you're going to be lost when you're talking to them about it. So I think you have to be really, what's it called, self-advocate, and really be clear about what you want since the beginning. Because yeah, if they don't want to do it, then they're not going to be willing to accommodate later on. So you're kind of wasting your time if you don't mention it right at the beginning, and you're wasting your time and their time, but mostly also yours, because you're the one that's putting together a whole application. So yeah.
I will say, oh, go
Oh.
ahead.
Yeah, maybe I'll try to be shorter this time. I think for me, in terms of like before law school, I mean, after while I was in my last year at Berkeley, I decided to apply for the Tech Equity Policy Fellowship. It was a mess trying to get me paid. It ended up being that the contract had to be between like the LLC I was part of and the organization. And that's another route as well, like just like could you start your own LLC and figure out what type of services you could provide. But that was traumatic. That was just a mess. But at some point I ended up, that contract ended up not being renewed. And then so like I was like, where do I go now? And I ended up, and this was also like during the pandemic, even though I feel like we're still going through it, especially like 2021 was very rough. I think for everybody, not just undocumented people, like, but in general, like the job market was really rough. And towards the end, I ended up just like, I don't know, I ended up just going into like this coaching gig, but it was just like education related. And I just disclosed my status to them and I was super unhappy. So I applied for somewhere else, and I applied for a startup, essentially that they're like a philanthropy platform. Super cool, amazing work. And I actually tried something new. I didn't disclose my status to them ever. I just told them like that I needed to go this route because this was the only route available to me. And they ended up being cool with it. I think it helped that I was gonna be going to law school within the same year. So I feel like those little things make a difference sometimes for the employer's part. But now that I've been in law school, my school has been super helpful. Like this summer, I was part of essentially the technology and startup law clinic full time. And then so the school was just able like to move money around and put it in my account. But for next year, I'm going into nonprofit, and they have a stipend, which is non-existent. I'm like, it's too low. Okay, please don't listen to this if you're the one employing me. No, but my school also gives like public interest scholarships, and then so that will supplement it. And there's other like there's other scholarships that I can apply for as well on top of that to do public interest work. I am in talks with a lot of like other professors who are trying to help me figure out but what's gonna happen after law school. And that's kind of like where I'm at, that in that like thinking space. And I've talked about this with Arabi, and just like little by little, you know, as the 2L starts forming, I'm learning what I'm good at, where I can grow more, and hopefully that informs what type of services or what I do in my 3L or post law school as well.
Just like one quick thing. Law schools don't, when you're applying, like they don't really care where you work before. Like they really don't. You can work anywhere or have any volunteer experience. What they do care about is that your application tells a cohesive story about why you want to go to law school and how all your experiences, whether that is academic or professional, has influenced that decision to go to law school. So you can, like, let's say you're working as like a waiter somewhere because you can't get paid as an undocumented person there, but then you're volunteering at, you know, somewhere where you're helping people study for their citizenship test, and you're just like volunteering there. Like you can talk about that volunteer experience and that how that has influenced your decision to go to law school, right? So that's just like one example. Like, or you can just turn anything into like a story. Like if you are have a position that you're able to get some income, but it's not necessarily tied to the law, you can kind of just turn it and spin it into a story. So I will say, don't stress too much about, oh, like I have to work at a law firm to like go to law school, or I had to work under this attorney to go to law school. Like you don't have to. And the way that like I got my internships before law school, because I went straight through to law school, partly because of that, because I knew that like I couldn't work if I took time off. So I just wanted to go straight through. Like I just reached out to my mentors and I was like, can I do research for you? Or can I just like help you with anything? I took a lot of volunteer positions. I did the Dream Summer Fellowship. If any of you don't know what that is, look into that. It's the UCLA Dream Summer Fellowship, great program. But yeah, and regarding like what to do after law school, if you can have access to it, try to go to like an immigration like attorney like consultation once a year if you can. Just like get caught up, even if you get like no, nothing can happen, you know, consistently, maybe 1 year, something that will change. Because that's kind of like what happened with me like this past 2 years. Like I kind of just went and they were like, yeah, this path might be open for you, take it. And now I have work authorization. So like it's just like things can happen for you, but you just have to like Katuska say, just advocate for yourself and constantly be looking into those resources. And it can be exhausting, but you gotta do what's best for you, you know?
Yeah, I think the three of you said some really good pieces of advice, especially like sharing your experience. So thank you for all of that. So we're getting close to the end of the panel. And the last question that I have for all of you is, where do you see yourself in 3 years? I know it's kind of like some of it we mentioned in like the panel responses or in your bios, but I want to hear it directly from you three. And if you can just answer it briefly, that would be great. But yeah, where do you see yourself in about 4 years?
Well, I want to be a lawyer, so hopefully I pass the California bar exam and I become an IP lawyer working in an international law firm. So, yeah, and supporting immigrants. So,
For me, also, I definitely want to do law. So I kind of like see myself as like, I don't know, being a middle person somewhere doing business and technology and figuring it out still. Because in 3 years, it'll be like my second year in post law school. So at least I imagine myself having enough money to pay my rent and vacations, and hopefully enough to like pay off some of the loans as well. But yeah, I see myself figuring it out still.
I'll hopefully be, because I am working for a firm next summer, so hopefully I'll be like bar in California and I'll just be an attorney in San Francisco. So hopefully.
Yes, come over to
I am
come
finally
over
making
here.
the move, Jesus. After like 4 years of trying, I'm finally making the move next summer.
Yes. I love that. Manifesting all of these goals for all of you, and I have no doubt that you all will achieve it. If you got this far, by like advocating for yourself, even when the systems don't seem to be in favor of a lot of undocumented students like us. You know, we got this far. We only have a little bit left, so we got this. But anyway, I just really want to appreciate your time to the three of you. I think this has been an incredibly inspiring panel to just hear how far you've come and how you are just really trailblazing for the rest of us. So just really feeling empowered and inspired by your stories, your experience. So just really thank you from the bottom of my heart for being part of this panel. And I also want to just like, you know, give in the plug for, oh yeah, also thank you, Gisela, for putting in your email. You don't have to, but if you want folks to connect with you, if they have any questions, feel free to add your email. But I just also want to include the plug for folks to apply to our pre-law bootcamp that's coming up in December. Our applications actually start today. They're open today. So Freddie or Alexander and Gisela were both part of the program, and Katuska has actually been invited as a speaker for the program in multiple times. So for folks that are interested in applying to law school for fall of 2024, this program would really support you in like a 4-day boot camp and like really exposing you to some technical workshops of just like the LSAT, the personal statements, also hearing stories from folks, like panels of various stages of the law school journey. So like folks that are currently law school students or folks that are now legal professionals. So really just a lot of different experiences. But yeah, apply. It's now open, and we're going to be sending out some communications around the applications as well. But anyway, really appreciating the three of you for your time and your sharing the space with all of us. Also, Adavi, thank you if you're still here. But again, thank you everyone for being part of this panel and for joining this webinar. And I wish you all a great rest of your evening. Thank you. Oh, and this is recorded, so we'll be sharing it with folks in case they want to go back and listening to it. So sorry, Gisela, did you say something?
No, nothing. I didn't say anything.
Oh,
Bye, everybody.
thank you,
Bye,
everyone.
everyone. Have a great night.